I recently faced a father's worst nightmare. The HOA security tased me in my own driveway with my 10-year-old watching through the window, and their excuse. They claimed they were just enforcing an 8 p.m. curfew. Funny thing is, the only thing they tested that night was my restraint. Let me start from the beginning. It all started with a piece of paper, a notice taped to my mailbox. Official letterhead, of course. The Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association, printed in a font that was trying way too hard to look regal. The notice informed me and all, my neighbors, of a new mandatory curfew. Not for us, you understand, for our mailboxes. We were not to approach, open, or step outside our homes between the hours of 8 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning. Failure to comply would result in a fine. I read it twice, laughed, and tossed it in the recycling bin. This was the kind of nonsense you expect from an HOA run by Karen Livingston, a woman who weaponized beige paint swatches and measured lawn height with a laser level. I had more important things to worry about. My daughter Rachel had a science project due, and my job was to make sure the miniature volcano didn't permanently fuse itself to our kitchen table. I was an ex-Marine who ran a custom auto shop. I dealt with IEDs in the desert. A stay-indoors curfew didn't exactly register on my thermometer. That was my first mistake. That night, the volcano was a smashing success, erupting with a satisfying glug of baking soda and vinegar all over a raw plastic tray. Rachel, all of 10 years old and with a smile that could disarm a battalion, was cheering. It was just past 8. I was cleaning up the mess when I remembered I'd forgotten to bring in the mail. Old habits die hard. I figured Karen Livingston wasn't lurking in the bushes with a stopwatch. I opened the front door, the cool night air a welcome change. The sky still held a bruised strip of orange. Summer evenings stay light even after 8. Rachel was right behind me, wanting to see the stars. I walked down the short driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under my boots. I reached the mailbox, pulled open the little metal door. I was about to reach inside when a dark windowless panel van, screeched to a halt beside me. No headlights. It just appeared out of the suburban darkness like a shark. 3 men spilled out before the van had even stopped rolling. They wore tight black polo shirts, stamped HOA security, earpieces glowing blue. No masks, faces smug and confident. They looked like overbuilt mall cops cosplaying special forces. My first thought, believe it or not, was that it was a prank. Maybe some local kids. Then I saw what they were holding. Not prank stuff. They were holding tasers, the nasty kind with the yellow cartridges, and they were sparking my Marine Corps training. The part of my brain that had been dormant since I traded my rifle for a wrench woke up with a jolt. "Rachel, get inside," I yelled, turning to shield her. "Lock the door," she screamed. A sound that ripped through me and scrambled back toward the house. That scream flipped a switch in me. The calm suburban dad vanished. The men didn't say a word. They just moved in. Clumsy three-pronged attack. They were labeled as HOA security on their cheap tactical vests. A detail so absurd it was almost funny. Almost out. One came at me from the front. The other 2 tried to flank me. I pivoted on my heel. The back of my shirt, patched with a faded USMC emblem, flashed in their headlights. No mistaking who they had messed with. Letting the front man's momentum carry him past me, I grabbed his outstretched arm, the one with the taser, twisted it behind his back in a way arms are not meant to bend, and used him as a shield. Against the second guy, there was a loud crack. A scream of pain from my new human shield, and the sickening feeling of bone giving way. His wrist was shattered. He dropped the taser. The second guy hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to shove his screaming buddy into him, sending them both tumbling into Karen Livingston's prize-winning petunias. The third guy was a little smarter. Stayed back trying to get a clear shot, but I was already moving, scooping up the dropped taser. He lunged. I sidestepped and jammed the business end of the device I'd just acquired into his thigh. The buzz was loud in the quiet night, followed by an inhuman shriek as he went down, twitching like a landed fish. The first two were scrambling to get up. I didn't give them a chance. I brought the butt of the taser down hard on the second man's hand as he reached for his own weapon. Another snap of bone echoed in the night air. He howled. They had come for a fight, but they hadn't expected one. They were bullies, not soldiers. They piled back into their van, dragging their twitching friend with them, and sped off into the darkness, leaving behind the smell of burnt ozone and trampled flowers. I stood there, chest heaving, my heart hammering against my ribs. I checked myself over. I was fine. Little scraped up, but fine. Then I remembered my helmet. I always wore it when I rode my motorcycle to and from the shop. It was a habit. I'd set it on top of the mailbox post when I got home, meaning to take it in. But I'd gotten distracted by the volcano project. It was still there, sitting on the post. And the camera, a tiny wide-angle lens I'd installed for insurance purposes, was still recording. It had captured everything. The van, the attack, the whole ugly ballet. I grabbed the helmet, my hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was starting to wear off. I looked at the dark shape of my house, the front. Door securely shut. Rachel was inside, safe. But for how long? A thought wormed its way into my brain, cold and sharp. One of the men, the one whose wrist I'd broken, had gasped something as he stumbled back. I'd thought it was just a curse. But now, in the silence, the words replayed in my head. He'd looked past me at my house number, illuminated by the porch. Light, and he'd said, clear as day, "This isn't the one. Wrong house. They had attacked the wrong house." My blood ran cold. This wasn't a random mugging. This wasn't a prank. This was a targeted, planned assault. And they got the address wrong, which meant someone else in my quiet, beige neighborhood was their intended target. But the most chilling part, the part that kept me standing, frozen, in my driveway was the realization that this brutal, clumsy attack happened during the one time frame our HOA queen, Karen Livingston, had ordered us to stay away from our mailboxes. It was a curfew designed to keep witnesses inside. I took a deep breath and looked up and down the silent street. Who were they after? And, more importantly, what had I just stumbled into? To understand how I ended up in a brawl with 3 goons, in my driveway, you have to understand Creekwood Estates. It's from the brochure. It was paradise, gentle rolling hills. A man-made lake that shimmered just right at sunset, and rows of houses that looked like they were copied and pasted from a board. Game called suburbia. It was exactly what I was looking for. After 2 tours overseas and the messy, heartbreaking chaos that followed, all I wanted was quiet. All I wanted was a place where my daughter Rachel could ride her bike without me scanning the rooftops. I left the cores, but the cores never fully leaves you. You're always checking exits, mapping routes, assessing threats. It's exhausting. I opened a garage, Alex's Auto Authority, where I could channel that obsessive attention to detail into something productive. Like rebuilding a classic V8. Engine instead of field stripping a rifle, Creekwood was supposed to be the final piece of the puzzle. A sanctuary where the loudest noise was a lawnmower on a Saturday morning. The guardian of this suburban sanctuary was the Homeowners Association. And its self-appointed supreme commander was Karen Livingston. Karen was a woman who seemed to be powered by low-grade rage and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of her own opinions. She was in her late 50s with a helmet of blonde hair that looked like it could deflect, small arms fire, and eyes that narrowed in suspicion at anything that deviated from the approved color palette. My first run-in with her was a week after I moved in. She left a laminated 200-word violation notice on my door because my garden hose was not coiled in a circumferentially uniform manner. I'd just spent 10 hours under a greasy pickup truck, and I found this bright yellow notice on my door. Ha! I actually thought it was a joke from one of my new neighbors. It WASN single quotes. The next week, it was the placement of my trash cans. They were apparently 3 inches too close to the sidewalk. A flagrant disregard for community aesthetics. Each violation came with a $50 fine, which doubled, if not paid, within 7 days. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Karen ruled the neighborhood through a complex web of bylaws so dense and contradictory that no one could possibly follow them all. This was by design. It gave her the power to target anyone she didn't like, and she didn't seem to like many people. I tried to be reasonable. At first, I went to an HOA meeting. It was held in her living room, which was decorated in 50 shades of beige and smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and disappointment. I watched as she belittled a sweet old lady for planting roses that were an unapproved shade of red. I saw her threaten a young couple with a lien on their house. Because their toddler's plastic slide was visible from the street, it wasn't about community standards. It was about control. It was her own private kingdom. I decided the best strategy was to keep my head down, pay the occasional ridiculous fine, and stay off her radar. I had Rachel to think about. I didn't need to pick a fight with the local tyrant over the curvature of my hose. That's where my neighbor Fred came in. Fred lived across the street. He was a retired accountant in his late 60s. A bird watcher with a pair of high-powered binoculars that he claimed were for spotting rare warblers, but which were almost always pointed at Karen Livingston's house. Fred was the neighborhood's unofficial historian and intelligence officer. "She's been running this place like a gulag for 15 years, he told me one afternoon over the fence, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. The last guy who challenged her for the presidency moved out 6 months later, said he couldn't take the harassment. Woke up one morning and his prize-winning poodle was dyed green. Green, Alex, the color of an unapproved decorative shrub. Fred was a bit of a character, prone to exaggeration, but he was also my best source of information. He knew who was on Karen's list and who was in her good graces. According to Fred, I was on thin ice because I drove a slightly too-loot motorcycle and had an American flag in my yard that was technically a few inches larger than the bylaws allowed. So, when the notice about the mailbox curfew appeared, I saw it for what it was. Another power trip, another arbitrary rule designed to remind us all who was in charge. I ignored it. I had a life to live. But after the attack, after standing in my driveway with the ghost of a taser's buzz still in my ears, the curfew didn't seem so arbitrary anymore. It seemed calculated. The phrase "wrong house" echoed in my head. This wasn't about me. This was about one of my neighbors. Karen's curfew wasn't just a power trip. It was a tool, was meant to provide cover to ensure there were no witnesses. When her enforcers came to pay someone a visit, the attack on me was a mistake, a blunder. They'd gotten the address wrong. I went inside, locked the door, and went straight to my computer. I plugged the helmet camera in, my mind racing. The video file popped up on the screen. I clicked play. The footage was clear, brutally so. The dark van, the goons, the attack. But I wasn't looking at the violence. I was listening. I was listening for anything that could tell me what this was really about. I had to know who the real target was. I had to know why. Because if they were willing to do this to the wrong person, I couldn't even imagine what they had planned for the right one. The raw video file was shaky, chaotic, and terrifyingly clear. I've watched it a dozen times, my focus shifting with each. Viewing first, I just watched the raw violence of it, the way the men moved, their mix of aggression and incompetence. If they weren't professionals, not really. They were thugs. Hired muscle. On the 13th viewing, I put on a pair of high-end headphones from my workshop, the kind I used to diagnose subtle engine noises, and closed my eyes. I turned the volume way up, filtering out the sounds of the scuffle. The grunts, my own shouting. I was listening for the spaces in between, for whispers. For clues, the van's engine was a low-quality diesel, poorly maintained. The men's boots were cheap, scuffing on the asphalt. Then I heard it. Just as the first man lunged, there was a crackle from a walkie-talkie on his belt. It was faint, almost lost in the noise, but my audio software could work miracles. I isolated. The frequency range filtered out the background hiss and amplified the signal. A voice, distorted and tiny, came through. Team 1. Confirm the creek is clear for deposit. Over. Deposit. Not a word you use for a simple beatdown. The creek. The dry creek bed that ran behind the houses on the far side of our neighborhood. It was a dusty, forgotten stretch of land, overgrown with weeds and littered with the occasional stray shopping cart. It was also completely out of sight, bordered by a thick stand of trees on one side and the back fences of a dozen houses on the other. Confirm the creek is clear for deposit. The phrase was clinical, detached. Sounded like business. This was much bigger than a personal grudge. My mind started connecting the dots. The 8 o'clock curfew, the attack to intimidate a resident, the mention of the creek. Something was happening back there. Something that required darkness and secrecy. Something worth hiring thugs to protect. I didn't have enough information. And I knew wandering back there alone was a stupid idea. I needed backup. I needed someone I could trust without question. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. He answered on the second ring. Viga's House of Pancakes. Did you flip him? We stack him. Dylan Viga, my best friend. We'd been through 2 tours together in the Marines. He was a recon sniper, a man who could stay perfectly still for 3 days waiting for a target, fueled only by beef jerky and an endless supply of terrible jokes. After we got out, he went into private security, the high-end kind, protecting corporate bigwigs from paparazzi and their own bad decisions. He was living the good life, but he was always bored. Dylan, it's Alex, I said, cutting to the chase. I've got a situation. The joking tone vanished from his voice instantly. What kind of situation? Scale of 1, 2? We're calling in an airstrike on our own position. Let's call it a solid 7. It's potential for escalation. I gave him the short version, the HOA, the curfew, the attack, the video, the message about the creek. He was silent for a long moment. Suburban HOA is running a Black Ops team. He finally said, "This is the most American thing I have ever heard. I'll be there in 2 hours. We're dark. Close. And for God's sake, tell me you still have that high-torque impact wrench. I have a stubborn lug nut on my Jeep." 2 hours later, Dylan's ridiculously oversized Jeep was parked a block away from my house. He slipped out of the driver's seat like a shadow, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked less like he was visiting the suburbs and more like he was preparing to overthrow a small government. He'd brought night vision goggles. Of course he had. "All right," he whispered as we crouched behind my back fence. "Let's go see what this deposit is all about." We moved through the backyards, sticking to the shadows, a skill that comes back to you like riding a bike. The neighborhood was dead silent. The curfew was clearly effective. We reached the edge of the woods that bordered the creek bed and found a spot with a clear view. We lay there in the dirt, the smell of damp earth filling my nostrils. For an hour, nothing happened. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I saw them. 2 sets of headlights creeping along the service road on the far side of the creek. They weren't cars, they were trucks. Big industrial tanker trucks. The kind used for hauling liquid waste. They pulled to a stop, their engines rumbling low and deep. Through Dylan's night vision, the scene snapped into sharp green-hued focus. Men in heavy work gear got out of the cabs. They unrolled thick hoses from the sides of the tankers and dragged them to the edge of the dry creek. With a sickening hiss, a torrent of thick, dark sludge began pouring out of the hoses, splashing onto the dusty ground. The smell hit us a second later, carried on the night breeze. It was acrid, chemical, and utterly vile. It smelled like poison that we're using. Our neighborhood as a private dumping ground, my blood went cold. This wasn't about uncoiled garden hoses or unapproved shades of red. This was about felony-level environmental crime. The HOA, Karen Livingston, the curfew, the thugs, it was all a smokescreen, a carefully constructed system to keep a whole community of people locked in their homes while these criminals poisoned the ground right behind our houses. "Deposit?" I muttered, the word tasting like bile in my mouth. Dylan lowered the goggles. his face grim in the moonlight. "Alex," he said, his voice deadly serious. "This isn't a 7 anymore. This is a full-blown 10. These people aren't just bullies. They're organized. They're funded. And they are way more dangerous than we thought. We had the what. We didn't have the who or the why." Dylan and I spent the rest of the night hashing out a plan. Going to the local cops was a non-starter. If this operation was as big as it seemed, there was no telling who was on the payroll. We needed leverage. We needed to control the narrative. The first step was to fire a warning shot to see how they'd react. I took a short, edited clip of the attack on me, just the van, the goons, no audio of the wrong house part, and sent it from a burner email to a local news blogger. A woman named Susan, who had a reputation for digging into stories the mainstream media wouldn't touch. I presented it as a concerned resident reporting a rise in crime in our peaceful community. I didn't mention the HOA. I didn't mention the dumping. I just lit a small fire to see who would come running to put it out. The blog post went up the next afternoon. It caused a small ripple at first, a few dozen comments, some chatter on the neighborhood's social media page. Then Karen Livingston responded. She didn't just deny it, she went on the attack. In a long, rambling post, she called the video a deceptive, highly edited piece of propaganda and a disgusting smear campaign orchestrated by a new disgruntled resident who refused to abide by community standards. That was me. She didn't use my name. But everyone knew who she meant. She announced an emergency increase in HOA dues to fund enhanced security patrols to protect us from these fabricated threats. She was doubling down. It was a classic bully tactic. Deny, attack, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. But it told me everything I needed to know. The fire was lit, and the Queen herself had come running with a bucket of gasoline. The retaliation was faster and more personal than I expected. 2 days later, I was driving Rachel to school. I tapped my brakes as I approached a stop sign, and the pedal went soft, spongy. I knew instantly what it meant. I yanked the emergency brake, bringing my truck to a screeching halt just inches from a minivan. Rachel was shaken, but okay. I got out, my hands trembling with rage, and looked. Under the truck. The brake line on the front driver's side wasn't leaking. It was cut. A clean, precise cut. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was sabotage. They had tried to kill me, and they didn't care that my daughter was in the car. That was the moment the game changed. This was no longer about fines, bylaws, or even illegal dumping. They had crossed a line. They had come after. My child. My world shrank. My only focus became protecting Rachel and taking these people down. I had Dylan pull her out of school and take her to his sister's place 3 towns over, a place no one would think to look. The house felt empty, silent, too quiet. I called my quirky neighbor, Fred. "Fred, I need you to be my eyes," I said, keeping my voice calm. Anything, and I mean anything that looks out of place. Cars that don't belong, people walking by too slowly. Call me. Fred, who had been training his whole life for this moment, took to the task with gusto. "A dark sedan has been parked at the end of the cul-de-sac for an hour. Alex?" he'd whisper into the phone. "The driver is pretending to read a newspaper, but the paper is upside down. It's an amateur, Alex, a rank amateur." His paranoid theatrics were a small comfort, a little island of humor in a sea of menace. He was my early warning system. Dylan and I used the information from Fred to beef up my security. We placed hidden cameras in the trees, motion sensors, along the fence line, and a pressure plate under the welcome mat. My quiet suburban home started to look like a fortified compound. The escalation came from the sky. I was in my garage late one night cleaning my tools when I heard a faint, high-pitched buzzing. It grew louder, a sound like a swarm of angry hornets. I killed the lights and peered out the window. Hovering over my roof were 5 drones, small, black, and agile. Each one had a single bright red LED that blinked in the darkness like a malevolent. They moved in formation, a synchronized silent patrol mapping my house, my property, my life. It was a message, a clear and unambiguous one. We see you. We're watching you. We know what you're doing. They weren't just trying to scare me anymore. They were gathering intelligence. They were preparing for their next move. I stood there, in the darkness, watching the red lights dance in the sky, a cold, hard knot of resolve tightening in my gut. They had brought the war to my doorstep. They had threatened my daughter. They had sent their mechanical eyes to spy on me. Fine, let them watch. I had no idea who they were dealing with. Thad started this, but I was going to finish it. Less than a day later, I found my next chance to strike back. They didn't wait long to test the next boundary. 24 hours after the drone show, I spotted a black Chevy Suburban idling 3 houses down. Same HOA security logo. Same smug posture. I jumped in my vintage Bronco and rolled past like I hadn't seen them. The Suburban's lights snapped on. The chase lit up the cul-de-sac. They tried the classic intimidation tactic tailgate within inches. Floodlights blazing through my back glass. Bad move. I dropped the Bronco into 4-high and cut across the drainage easement. Ollie locals know? Gravel exploded behind me. There. Polished tires fish-tailed on the loose rock. At the far exit, I punched the emergency brake and threw her into a spinning J-turn. I'd taught this maneuver to recruits, but it feels better when it saves your skin. Their driver overcorrected, plowed into a mailbox, and skid-stalled sideways. I jumped out, camera rolling, and planted a road flare 6 feet from their bumper. Red sparks hissed under the security decal. We locked eyes through the windshield. The front passenger, the same bearded enforcer whose wrist I'd spared, reached for something under the seat. I leveled my phone instead of a pistol. Smile for the civil suit, gentlemen. Sirens wailed in the distance. Neighbor phones were already out. They slammed the Suburban into reverse, metal crunching as they limped away. Another battle won. Data card of pristine video richer. I caught my breath against the Bronco's hood, adrenaline still humming in my veins. The drones were a gift. Amateurs use off-the-shelf consumer models. Professionals use custom rigs. But even those have components that can be traced. Dylan was a genius at this stuff. He didn't just see a drone, he saw a collection of parts: the gimbal mount, the flight controller, the transmission frequency. "This isn't some kid's toy, Alex," he said, studying the high-resolution photos I'd taken. "This is professional-grade surveillance equipment, the kind of thing security contractors use." He spent 48 hours buried in his digital world, fueled by coffee and a righteous fury I hadn't seen in him since our days in the service. He cross-referenced parts distributors, FCC filings for transmission signals, and dark web forums where security techs bragged about their gear. Finally, he got a hit. The specific combination of components was unique to one company, a private security firm called Aegis Technical Solutions. Aegis was a high-priced mercenary outfit that provided security for corporations dealing with sensitive logistical challenges. That was a fancy way of saying they made problems disappear. But who hired them? Dylan dug deeper. He pulled up Aegis' client list, most of which was confidential, but a few contracts were public record. And one name stood out: Omnicorp, a massive multinational chemical and manufacturing giant. The kind of company with a building downtown that blocked out the sun and a legion of lawyers on retainer. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. The tanker trucks weren't just some local yahoos dumping used motor oil. This was a corporate-level operation. Omnicorp was paying Aegis to provide security for their illegal dumping. And Karen Livingston's HOA was the local tool they used to enforce the curfew and keep the residents quiet. She wasn't the mastermind. She was the useful idiot, the petty tyrant who got a taste of power and a payoff to look the other way. This was bigger, dirtier, and more dangerous than I could have imagined. Dylan kept digging into Omnicorp, and what he found turned my stomach. String of environmental lawsuits in other states all mysteriously dropped. Whistleblowers who had recanted their testimony. Journalists who had suddenly abandoned their investigations. Omnicorp didn't just have lawyers, they had a department dedicated to burying their secrets. And then came the twist. The one that knocked the wind out of me. Dylan was scrolling through Omnicorp's board of directors, looking for a connection. To our town, to Karen, to anyone. And he found a name. Not a high-level executive, not some shadowy figure. It was a local name, a respected name. Councilman Miller, David Miller. It's a man who had cut the ribbon at the opening of the new community center. The man who gave speeches about civic pride and environmental responsibility just 6 months ago. I had watched him present Karen Livingston with a Community Leader of the Year award, praising her for her unwavering dedication to maintaining Creekwood's pristine character. It was all a lie, a sick, twisted joke. Miller wasn't just a crooked politician on the take. He was on the board. He was one of them. He wasn't just covering for them. He was directing them. Karen wasn't his partner. She was his pawn. I felt like I'd been punched. In the gut. The man who shook our hands and kissed our babies was actively poisoning us for profit. The rage I felt was pure and white-hot. But before I could even process it, before I could even begin to formulate a new plan, they made their move. They knew I was getting close. The drone surveillance wasn't just intimidation, it was reconnaissance. For their next attack, I was on my way to my workshop, my mind reeling with the revelation about Miller when a police car pulled me over. Standard procedure, the officer said. A broken taillight. I knew my taillight wasn't broken. I'd checked my truck from top to bottom that morning as I was reaching for my license and registration. A second officer walked around to the passenger side. He shone his flashlight into the cab. "What's that on the floor?" he asked, his voice suddenly hard. I looked down. On the passenger side floor mat was a small plastic baggie containing a white powder. A baggie that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the first officer said, his hand on his weapon. It was a setup. A perfect, clean, undeniable setup. They weren't going to cut my brakes again. They weren't going to send thugs. They were going to use the system against me. They were going to paint me as a criminal, discredit me, and bury me in a legal nightmare. The officer pulled the baggie out. Well, he said, holding it up. "Looks like we got a bag of fentanyl here." The world tilted on its axis. Fentanyl, a trafficking charge. They weren't just trying to sideline me, they were trying to put me away for 20 years. The cuffs were cold and heavy as they clicked shut around my wrists. As they pushed my head down into the back of the squad car, I saw the second cop talking. On his phone, he glanced over at me and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He wasn't talking to dispatch. He was reporting his success. I was neutralized, was in their system. And as the car pulled away, leaving my truck on the side of the road, I had no idea how I was going to get out. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect. A concrete bench, a toilet with no seat, and the overwhelming smell of bleach and despair. I sat there. The events of the last few weeks were playing in my mind like a low-budget horror movie. The taser attack, the cut break line, the drones, and now this. It's a felony drug charge. They had me cold. The system I had once believed in, the one I had sworn to defend, was being turned against me like a loaded weapon. My court-appointed lawyer visited me a few hours later, while he was young, overworked, and already looked defeated. He glanced at the police report and sighed. "Look, Mr. Alex," he said, not making eye contact. "The evidence is what it is. An officer saw it in plain sight. They're going to push for a trafficking charge. My advice, we plead this down. Take a deal. Maybe we can get it down to simple possession. You'll do some time, but not decades." Some time, the words hung in the air between us. Time away from my daughter. Time while these monsters continued to poison my neighborhood, my friends, my home. I would lose my business. I would lose my house. I would lose Rachel. The weight of it all pressed down on me. And for the first time, I felt a crack in my resolve. Maybe he was right. Maybe the smart play was twofold: to minimize the damage, to just survive. I was at my lowest point, sitting in that cell when the door buzzed open. A guard grunted. "You?" Made bail. I walked out into the sterile hallway, confused. I didn't have that kind of money. Standing there, leaning against the wall with a smirk on his face, was Dylan. He had a bag with a change of clothes for me and a coffee in his hand. "Figured you could use this," said, handing me the cup. "I had to sell my prize collection of vintage G.I. Joes, but you're worth it." He was lying, of course. He'd probably cashed out some higher-risk stock or called in a marker of his own. It didn't matter. He was there. "How's Rachel?" was the first thing I asked, my voice low. "She's fine," he said, his tone softening. "She's teaching my sister's poodle how to play chess. She's safe. Now, let's get you home." The ride back was silent. I just stared out the window at the world that was moving on without me. A world where I was now a registered felon. When we got back to my house, the place felt violated, tainted. I walked into the garage, my sanctuary, and just stood there. Dylan let me be for a minute. Then he walked over and stood next to me. "So, what's the plan?" he asked quietly. "The lawyer said I should take a deal," I mumbled. "He said they've got me." Dylan turned to face me, and the smirk was gone. His eyes were hard. "The lawyer is wrong," he said, his voice low and intense. "The man I served with would never take a deal. The man I saw pull 3 guys out of a burning Humvee wouldn't roll over and show his belly because some corrupt councilman planted a bag of powder in his truck. They put their hands on your daughter's life, Alex. They tried to put you in a cage. Are you going to let them win?" He was right. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the despair that had started to crystallize around my heart. What was I thinking? Surrender. Let them take everything. Let them win. No, not now. Not ever. This was the moment, the moral crossroads. Do I trust the broken, corrupted system to maybe someday give me a sliver of justice? Or do I take justice into my own hands? The core question I'd been wrestling with bloomed in my mind. How far will a man go to defend his own? The answer was suddenly terrifyingly clear. I looked at Dylan, and he saw the shift in my eyes. The doubt was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire. "They want a war," I said. "We'll give them one." I walked over to my workbench, pushing aside tools and schematics until I found what I was looking for: a satellite phone. Old and bulky, but secure. A relic from my past I never thought I'd need again. I held it in my hand. It felt heavy. It was the point of no return. I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. I was about to call in markers from men who operated in the shadows. Men who didn't care about plea bargains or rules of engagement. I was about to choose a path outside the law to get the justice the law couldn't provide. I opened the phone and began to dial a number from memory. Dylan watched me, a silent understanding passing between us. He knew what I was doing. He knew who I was calling. I put the phone to my ear, my gaze falling on a large map of Creekwood estates I had pinned to the wall. I looked at the creek, the houses, the service roads. It wasn't just a map anymore. It was a battlefield. The phone clicked, and a voice answered on the other end, gruff and familiar. "Yeah, it's me," I said, my voice steady. "I'm calling in the marker. All of it." Stared at the map hat. The empire of dirt and corruption built by Karen Livingston and David Miller. We're going to burn them to the ground. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. We called it Operation Smokey Bear. The goal wasn't to engage them in a firefight or a street brawl. The goal was to use their own arrogance and predictability against them to herd them into a cage of their own making, all under the brightest lights we could find. My old recon unit arrived over the next 24 hours, not as a squad of commandos, but as individuals. There was Marcus, a comms genius who could hack into a network with a laptop and a half-eaten bag of chips. There was Leo, a demolitions expert, who now designed pyrotechnics for movies. And there was Ghost, a man who could blend into any environment so well you'd forget he was there till he tapped you on the shoulder. They were my brothers, and they had answered the call without hesitation. We gathered in my garage, which now resembled a mission command center. The map of Creekwood was covered in overlays and notes. They dumped twice a week like clockwork, I explained, pointing to the service road behind the creek. Tuesday and Friday nights, right after the 8 o'clock curfew ensures the whole neighborhood is buttoned up. They're cocky. They think they're invisible. Marcus nodded, tapping away at his laptop. Their sense of security is their biggest vulnerability. We don't attack the operation, we manipulate it. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. We were going to create a fake wildfire not with actual fire, but with the illusion of one. Leo, the pyrotechnics expert, got to work, building a series of high-output, non-toxic smoke generators, the kind used on film sets. We would place them in the woods on the far side of the creek, upwind from the neighborhood. Marcus, meanwhile, was going to work his magic on the local infrastructure. He'd found a loophole in the county's emergency alert system, a backdoor that would allow him to issue a highly targeted evacuation order for just our small section of Creekwood Estates. The night of the operation was tense. A thick fog, both real and manufactured, hung in the air. My team was in position. Leo had his smoke generators ready. Ghost was hidden near the service road, our eyes on the ground. Dylan had found a high vantage point a half-mile away, equipped with a camera that had a lens the size of a cannon. He would be our primary live stream operator. I was in my house with Marcus, monitoring a bank of laptops showing feeds from a dozen hidden cameras we'd placed along the evacuation route. The final piece of the puzzle was neighbor Fred. I'd given him a simple but crucial job. Fred, whatever you do, stay inside, I told him. But keep your camera pointed at the end of the street just in case. At 9:15 p.m., Marcus hit the button. Showtime, he whispered, instantly. Cell phones all over the neighborhood lit up with the blaring tone of an emergency alert. Wildfire warning, the message read. Mandatory evacuation for Creekwood Estates, sectors 4 and 5. Proceed immediately to designated route, simultaneously. Leo's smoke machines kicked into high gear, pumping thick gray smoke into the sky, creating the convincing illusion of a nearby blaze. The effect was immediate panic. People poured out of their houses, confused and scared. Cars started clogging the streets. It was the chaos we were counting on. We knew Omnicorp's goons would be monitoring police scanners. There would be no official report of a fire, which would confuse them. But the visual evidence of the smoke and the chaos of the evacuation would force their hand. They had a schedule to keep. A multi-million-dollar dumping operation doesn't just take the night off. Their choice was simple: scrub the mission and lose a fortune, or rush the job and get out before the roads were officially closed by emergency services, just as I predicted. They chose to rush. At 9:47 p.m., Ghost's voice crackled over the comms. I have eyes on the convoy. 2 tankers and a lead car. They're moving fast. They're taking the bait. My heart hammered in my chest. I watched on my screen as the tanker trucks, their headlights cutting through the fake smoke, bypassed the main roads and turned onto the designated evacuation route. A quiet back road that we had lined with hidden cameras. A road that led them directly into our trap. Dylan's voice came over the comms, calm and steady. I have them in my sights, crystal clear. Beginning live stream in 5, 4, 3, 2. Convoy rolled to a stop right in the kill zone, a perfectly illuminated stretch of road right next to the creek. The doors of the lead car and the tankers opened. The men scrambled out, dragging the thick hoses, clearly agitated and rushing to get the job done. The live stream was active. broadcasting to a dozen platforms under the title, "What is Omni? Corp dumping in our backyard?" I watched on one of the screens as the view count started to climb 10 viewers, 100, 1,000. It was working. The trap was sprung. The whole world was about to see what these people were doing. And then everything went sideways. This was the part of the plan I hadn't accounted for, the variable that changed the entire equation and turned our clever trap into a scene of utter chaos. It was the first of 2 twists that night, and it almost got us all killed. The men pouring out of the lead car weren't the usual batch of clumsy thugs. As Dylan zoomed in with his high-powered lens, we saw them clearly. They were kitted out in full tactical gear, carrying rifles, not pistols. These were Aegis tactical operators, ex-military contractors. The pros, and they knew instantly that something was wrong. One of them held up a device, a scanner that picked up the wireless signals from our hidden cameras. "We're lit up," he yelled, his voice carrying in the night air. "It's an ambush." Before we could even react, they opened fire. Not at us. They didn't know where we were, but at the first set of approaching headlights. It was a single police car, a local patrolman, probably responding to the chaos of the fake evacuation. The crack of rifle fire shattered the night. The police car swerved and crashed into a ditch. This was no longer a covert operation to expose a crime. It was an active firefight. A lie. My blood ran cold. This had escalated beyond my worst fears. And then came the second twist, the one that made my jaw hit the floor. The passenger door of the lead car, the one the Aegis commander had just exited, swung open. A figure stepped out into the glare of the remaining headlight, silhouetted against the swirling smoke. The figure was short, clad in a ridiculously expensive-looking pantsuit. It was screaming orders with a voice that could curdle milk. It was Karen Livingston. She wasn't at home monitoring her little kingdom. She wasn't just a puppet taking orders. She was here on site. She was the supervisor, the field marshal of this toxic army. She was pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the crashed police car, yelling, "Deal with that. We have to finish the dump." The live stream camera caught it all. Her face, twisted in a mask of rage and panic, was broadcast to thousands of viewers, clear as day. The HOA queen wasn't just complicit, she was a hands-on manager of an environmental terror cell. The situation was spiraling out of control. The Aegis team laid down suppressing fire, keeping the lone officer pinned down. Sirens began to wail in the distance, more of them now, responding to the reports of shots fired. This was a real emergency. My plan had worked, but it had also kicked over a hornet's nest the size of a city block, as Karen was screaming at her hired guns. A third element entered the fray, one I never could have anticipated. My neighbor Fred, the man I had told to stay inside to just keep his camera on the end of the street. Apparently, Fred's sense of civic duty, or maybe just his insatiable curiosity, had gotten the better of him. He came power walking out of his house, his little camcorder held in front of him like a holy relic. He was filming from a completely different angle, a side angle that captured not just Karen and her goons, but the road behind them. And into Fred's frame drove another car, a sleek black sedan that pulled up about 50 yards behind the convoy. The driver's side door opened and a man got out, bathed in the red and blue glow of the approaching police lights. He was on his phone, clearly agitated. It was Councilman David Miller. He wasn't on the Omnicorp board from a distance. He was here on the ground, arriving at the scene of the crime. The mastermind was coming to check on his investment. Fred's shaky amateur footage captured the one thing my perfectly placed professional cameras had missed: the direct, irrefutable link between the corporate boardroom and the toxic sludge. Pouring into the creek, Miller saw the police lights, saw Karen screaming, saw the armed contractors, and his face went pale. He knew he was caught. He froze like a deer in the headlights, caught between his criminal enterprise and the rapidly approaching arm of the law. The air was filled with smoke, sirens, and the sound of helicopters chopping the air overhead. Karen and Miller, the two. Heads of the snake were trapped, exposed, and illuminated for the whole world to see on a dozen different camera feeds. The chaos was absolute. The operation was a success, but the fallout was just beginning. The scene devolved from a tense standoff into a full-blown federal incident in a matter of minutes. The first to arrive were the county sheriffs, forming a perimeter. But right behind them were the state police, and not long after, black SUVs with government plates, the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division, and the FBI. The live stream had gone viral, pinging keywords like Omnicorp, hazmat, and shots fired, which triggered every automated alert in every three-letter agency on the eastern seaboard. The cavalry wasn't just coming, they had arrived with overwhelming force. My team and I were ghosts. It already melted back into the night. Our job was done. It fed anonymous tips to the FBI's National Threat Center using Marcus' untraceable network, pointing them to the live stream and corroborating everything with the footage from my helmet cam and the videos of the tankers. I had taken with Dylan. We weren't vigilantes. We were concerned citizens providing evidence. That was the story, and we were sticking to it. The showdown at the creek was a spectacle of defeat. The Aegis contractors, professional as they were, knew a losing fight when they saw one. Surrounded, outgunned, and with their employers' identities plastered all over the internet. They dropped their weapons and surrendered. They were cuffed and processed with grim efficiency. But the main event was Karen Livingston. She did not go quietly. She shrieked, she kicked, she accused. When a stern-faced FBI agent finally slapped the cuffs on her, she tried to play her last pathetic card. It was him, she screamed, her voice raw. The man in House 112, Alex. He set this all up. He's the criminal. The agent just looked at her, his face a mask of stone-cold indifference, and tightened the cuffs. Her presence at the scene, her commands caught on video, made her accusations sound like desperate ramblings. She had gone from the queen of her beige kingdom to a federal suspect in the back of a police car in less than an hour. Councilman Miller tried a different tactic. He attempted to play the part of the concerned public official arriving to assess the situation. But Fred's video, which Fred had proudly handed over to the first agent he saw, telling him, "I have it all on tape, young man," the whole sordid affair, destroyed his story. It showed him arriving before the bulk of law enforcement, clearly there for a meeting, not an inspection. The agents escorted him to a separate, unmarked car. He didn't scream or fight. He just seemed to shrink, the power and authority draining from him until he was just a man in a nice suit. His career and his freedom evaporating in the flashing blue and red lights. I watched it all from a safe distance, hidden on a hill overlooking the scene with Dylan. The air smelled of smoke, wet dirt, and a strange kind of victory. My part of the fight was over. The physical threat was neutralized. I saw one of my team members, Leo, walking towards me. He wasn't alone. Holding his hand was my daughter, Rachel. She had a pair of sound-dampening earmuffs on, and her eyes were wide, taking in the spectacle of flashing lights below. She wasn't scared. She looked curious, resilient. She saw me and ran, burying her face in my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I held my daughter, the reason for all of this, and watched as the last of the criminals were led away. The noise began to fade into a background hum. The crackle of radios, the slam of car doors, the distant sound of cuffs snapping shut. The battle was over. The immediate danger was gone. But as I stood there on that hill, with Rachel safe in my arms and the lights of justice cutting through the darkness below, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a long road to clean up the mess, both the poison in the creek and the corruption in our town. The war was won, but now we had to rebuild the peace. The aftermath was a legal avalanche. The evidence was so overwhelming, so public that there was nowhere for Omnicorp or its cronies to hide. The viral live stream, my helmet cam footage, Dylan's high-definition videos of the dumping, and the star witness testimony from a very proud neighbor. Fred created an open and shut case. Federal prosecutors indicted Karen Livingston, Councilman Miller, and 5 senior executives from Omnicorp on a raft of charges, including violations of the Clean Water Act, racketeering, and thanks to the arms stand-off domestic environmental terrorism. They all tried to point fingers, but the digital breadcrumbs my team had laid out led directly to the top. Their lawyers made noise, but in the end, most of them took plea deals to avoid spending the rest of their lives in a federal prison. Karen got 15 years. Miller got 20. The Omnicorp executives got sentences that ensured they'd never poison another community again. The Creekwood Estates HOA was dissolved by court order, its bylaws declared predatory, and its leadership criminally corrupt. A wave of relief washed over the neighborhood. People started planting the wrong color roses, leaving their garden hoses uncoiled, and painting their doors bright, cheerful colors. The cloud of beige oppression had lifted. The bogus Sentinel charge against me was not just dropped, it was expunged with a formal public apology from the chief of police, who had been forced to clean house after the scandal revealed several of his officers were on Miller's payroll. That victory was sweet, but the real justice came from the civil suit. My lawyer, a new one who didn't specialize in plea bargains, filed a massive class action lawsuit on behalf of the entire community against Omnicorp. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and crippling public outrage, they settled for a figure that had 9 zeros in it. The money was transformative, but it wasn't for new cars or fancy vacations. It was for healing. I took a significant portion of my settlement and did the one thing no one expected. I bought the poison land, all of it the dry creek bed, and the woods on either side. I then used the rest of the money to fund a full-scale, no-expense-spared environmental cleanup. For months, crews in hazmat suits worked tirelessly, removing tons of contaminated soil and restoring the land to what it should have been. And finally, we came to the payoff. 1 year later, I stood in that same spot, but it was no longer a dusty, toxic crime scene. The creek, now fed by a clean water source, gurgled happily. The land was covered in lush green grass, wildflowers, and newly planted saplings. We had turned a wound into a sanctuary, the Creekwood Community Park and Garden. I plunged a shovel into the soft earth, making a hole for one last tree. Beside me, Rachel did the same, her face beaming with pride. Dylan was there, leaning on his shovel and telling a terrible joke to neighbor Fred, who was documenting the entire event with his ever-present camcorder. I looked around at the families from my neighborhood picnicking on the grass, at the kids chasing butterflies where tanker trucks once leaked poison. I had been pushed, threatened, and framed. I'd had to ask myself how far I would go to protect my own. I had gone all the way to the edge. And in doing so, I found I wasn't just defending my daughter and my home, I was defending all of them. The final lesson was clear. Sometimes, too, protect the peace. You have to be willing to go to war. I placed the young oak tree into the earth and shoveled dirt around its base. Rachel patted the soil down, her small hands working alongside mine. She looked up at me, her smile bright and fearless. She was safe. We were all safe. And in the quiet hum of our reborn community, I had finally found the peace I'd been searching for all along.